Hi everybody, this is Professor Struber again. Welcome to Session 2 of IT 604, IT Project Management. In our last session, we defined a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. Projects are undertaken to support changes to an organization's strategy and priorities. Typically, changes to the organizational strategy and priorities are made at the C-level of an organization as a reaction to or in order to preempt changes in market demand, technological progress, changes in legal requirements, and so on. The organizational strategy and priorities then gives rise to objectives from which are derived the goals for doable units in order to make the goals of the organizational strategy and priorities a reality. These portfolios are typically organized at a functional level, like for example marketing projects, for example finance projects, and then subdivided further into programs. Programs are more of a practical nature in which we're saying we're going to improve the marketing database, we're going to improve the CRM system, and we can share developers across programs. And then we have, as a subdivision of programs, further we have individual projects. This is where we will be working in this course at the project level, which you're seeing here in blue. When we manage projects, we manage not just the traditional scope, budget, and schedule, which you do see here in the circle at the bottom, but we also need to be concerned about project quality. We need to be concerned about project resources, of course, and most importantly project risk, because all of this has to do with people, and projects can only be successful and they can only produce what the green arrow shows here and the blue call out. They can only produce value if everything in this circle is managed well and if the people support this management and follow the mission of the project. Who are those people? Those people are typically called stakeholders, and you see the stakeholders at the right side of this slide. We have the team internal stakeholders such as yourself, the project management team like business analysts and so on, and the team members, the engineers. And then you have outside stakeholders here such as the sponsor, operations management, PMO, and functional management, and others. We further learned in the last session that projects have 5 phases, namely initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. And that throughout these 5 phases, whether they repeat or not, we use skills from 10 areas, namely project integration management, project scope management, project schedule management, project cost management, project quality management, project resource management, communications management, risk management, procurement management, and stakeholder management. So skills from these 10 knowledge areas are used throughout all of these phases, all of these 5 phases. And it doesn't matter in which kind of organization you are, whether you operate in a functional organizations where managers have all the power and the project manager is looked at as a project expediter or a coordinator and really has no power to make decisions, or whether you are in a projectized organization in which the project manager works for a project management organization that is specifically set up such that the project manager has all of the managing power and responsibility, or whether you work in one of the most frequently found organizational shapes, which is the matrix organization, in which the project manager has some power but it is shared with the functional managers, so that really every employee in a way has 2 managers, one being the project manager, one being the functional manager, sometimes also called the HR manager. Did you realize that a project can come in on time and on budget and still fail? That is because it's the primary goal of a project not to come in on time and on budget, but to produce value for the organization and for the end user. In other words, you can deliver the most beautiful application that looks great, that functions well. You can come in on time and on budget, but if nobody uses your application or if you've built the wrong thing, then your project has still failed and you have wasted the organization's money and time. This is why it is so important at the beginning of a project to outline the expected measurable organizational value that this project is supposed to produce, and that we are going to start measuring at the end of the project lifecycle. So at the beginning of our project planning framework really stands the goal of the project in terms of what do we want this project to do at the end of its life cycle, or what do we want the service or the project result to do at the end of its life cycle, and how are we going to measure it. And only if we have this question sufficiently answered, which is what you're seeing in yellow here, can we move on to define the scope of a project and then consider what kind of phase framework we're going to select, whether waterfall, agile, hybrid, anything in between. And only when we know that can we start developing the tasks and sequence the tasks, assign resources, come up with time estimates for the tasks, and thus produce the schedule and the budget. And since establishing measurable organizational value before the start of a project is so important, this is what we're going to talk about right now: measurable organizational value and the business case. Our goal in this module is to be able to describe and develop a project's measurable organizational value, and to look into what it takes to prepare a business case so that we can understand how projects are selected and also continually reviewed for their performance and for their applicability to the overarching organizational strategy and priorities. Here's a great graphic from our textbook that shows how the 5 phases fit together. In our textbook, the 5 phases are define, plan, execute, close, and evaluate. And as you can see in the execute, and control project are merged into one phase that contains the software development life cycle. We also see the deliverables for each of these phases. Those are the major deliverables. There are also minor deliverables for each phase. And we're seeing that in the conceptualize and initialize project kind of process group in the define phase, really, we have the business case as our deliverable. This business case is what will keep us busy for the rest of this module. For the plan phase, we have the project charter and plan as the major deliverable. For the closed project phase, not surprisingly, we have the final project report and presentation as deliverable. And for the evaluate phase, we have the project evaluations and the lessons learned as the deliverable. The only phase that has what we might be used to as the typical deliverable for an IT project, namely the information system, is the execute phase right here in the middle of the slide, which is where the actual install and delivery of the product or service or result of the IT project happens, and where that is then being transferred to maintenance and support and operations eventually. So in this module, we're going to talk about the conceptualize and initialize phase. The conceptualize and initialize phase maps pretty well to the initiating phase in the PMI definition of the 5 project phases. The important thing is whether or not these phases repeat or not: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. We always manage people, and we manage scope, quality, schedule, budget, resources, and risk. That does not change. We have to manage these throughout all these 5 phases. So then let's talk about how projects are being selected and how they're being ranked within an organization. It all starts and ends with measurable organizational value. As you already know, each project in an organization is derived from the organizational strategy and priorities that the C-level has set for the next 5 to 10 years. And each project is expected to deliver value back to the organization based on its investment. Now note that the value is supposed to increase or multiply the initial investment. So how can we measure this value? Well, we have to find ways of quantifying what the result is that comes out of a project. Of course, this measurable organizational value must be agreed upon also among all parties, especially the C-level and the project manager. It must be verifiable at the end of the project, so it has to be measurable because otherwise we couldn't verify. And last but not least, we have to emphasize that this value must align with an organization's strategy and goals. A project can come in on time and on budget and build all of the scope, but if the project builds the wrong thing at the wrong time, then the project in itself has no value to the organization. That said, it is very important that we understand that within the life cycle of projects and organizational strategy and priorities, project managers are expected to learn from the outcome of previous projects in order to make things happen better, faster, cheaper, and of course more. As our textbook shows, the 4 drivers of measurable organizational value are scope, that is the project work that has to be completed, schedule, budget, and of course quality, which is the conformance to what you initially set out to build or the fitness for use. Typically, there are 5 areas of potential impact for IT projects. These are strategic, customer-focused, financial, operational, and social. Within an organization, the major upfront investments will be made for the first 4 areas because they directly help improve the organization as such. This also means that at the beginning of the MOV definition, the area of impact will have to be pinpointed, and then the desired value or the desired increase in value as a result of the outcome of your project will be defined. How do we define that? Well, we have to develop a metric to measure this value, either in dollars or in percent or in various other ways. And then it is not enough to just set a target value for the goal of the project, but also there has to be a time frame for achieving this measurable operational value. So for example, within 6 months, within a year, within 2 years, we want to see 20% increase in the customer base. Then this measurable organizational value, this target for a project, will be verified with major stakeholders to get buy-in. That can be, depending on the organization's size, even shareholders in the shareholder community, and then transformed into a success statement that reads something like, this project will be successful if, and then a number of bullet points, and that success statement will then translate into the business case for the project. The business case, which we will talk about in a little bit, then is the major justification and the development of the goal for each project within an organization. But before we even generate the business case, we need to understand what the differential is between the total benefits of ownership, that is the increase of high value work, improving accuracy and efficiency in processes in an organization, etc., and the total cost of ownership, which is initially the investment into the project itself. In order to measure that differential between the benefits and the cost of ownership, we have a number of financial models. For example, the payback period, a break-even point, return on investment or ROI calculations, and net present value. We will walk through these in a moment. The mathematical forecasting tools are, however, only one criterion in the ranking of project options in an organization. As we can see here, the mathematical forecasting tools such as ROI, payback, and NPV, that is net present value, only address the financial dimensions. We have a whole set of other criteria such as organizational, which are the alignment with strategic objectives, without which nothing happens in an organization. The likelihood of achieving a project's MOV, that is the doability of the project. Then project criteria specific to the people in a project, the availability of the skilled team members, the time they would take to develop the project, that is the product or the result of the service, and then the maintainability of the outcome as well, and the risk that the project either poses to the organization in terms of investment or the risks that are involved in the completion of the project itself. The probably most important criterion for project selection would be external in terms of customer satisfaction, where increased customer satisfaction, of course, also leads to increased market share. Each of these criteria receive a weighting score here, and then these weights and the evaluations are applied to various different project options. Here we see A, B, and C. And the project with the highest total score then will rank at the top of the execution list, whereas projects with a lower total score will go further down towards the on the project priority list. So once we have used all the forecasting tools, we've done all the math, we have considered all the criteria, we have weighted the criteria, and we have established the ranking list of all the potential projects that we could do in an organization, it is time to write up the business case. At the end of all the forecasting and ranking activities for various projects in an organization stands the business case. The business case summarizes all the activities that came before it, and as such it is an analysis of the organizational value, feasibility, costs, benefits, and risks of several proposed alternatives or options for projects in themselves or within projects. A good business case has a number of characteristics. It is thorough, it clearly and logically compares the cost-benefit rankings of each proposed option, and it recommends a specific option for the execution of a project. So let's summarize how we end up with a good business case. First of all, a good business case happens in the initiating phase of each project, and it defines why the business should invest in the project and how likely it is that the project will succeed and return value to the organization. We discussed how it is important to start each business case with a definition of the measurable organizational value, and then a cross-functional team will get to work to identify and evaluate alternatives, to assess the feasibility and the risk of each project that's on their docket, and then to define the total cost and benefit of ownership of each proposed project, and then analyze the alternatives and recommend the best solution. That leads us to the business case. So as we have seen, developing a business case really involves a lot of forecast mathematics. The first model that we need to consider is called the payback period. The payback period is the period of time that is required to recapture the funds that are expended, that is invested into a project, or to reach the break-even point at which investment and returned value are even. So here we can see a typical calculation in the bottom of the slide, where the payback period is the initial investment that is divided by the estimated annual net cash flow. So for example, if the initial investment into a project was $100,000 and the estimated annual net cash flow, that is the return that we're expecting for a project once the project is done per year, is $20,000, then the payback period is 5 years, because 100,000 divided by 20,000 is 5. And since we always want to do things faster, better, and cheaper, of course, shorter payback periods are better and preferred to longer payback periods. The second very widely used financial forecasting model for an investment is called the break-even point. The break-even point is the point, as you can see in the graphic on the right hand here, at which total cost and total revenue are equal. That is, at which investment or loss turns into profit or turns into value received. Break-even point is not measured in years, as was the payback period that we have seen earlier, but it is measured in units sold or units used. Our example here is that you sell a golf putter for $30 and it costs $25 to make, so that your profit margin is $5. And then the question is, what is your break-even point? That is, how many units do you have to sell in order to turn your investment into a profit? For that, we divide the initial investment by the net profit margin, and assuming that we have invested $100,000 again, we divide that by $5, and then we end up with 20,000 units that we would have to sell or that we would have to put into use in order to reach the break-even point, or the point at which the investment finally makes sense because it transforms into value gained or profit. In contrast to the payback period, which is measured in years, or the break-even point, which is measured in deployed units, where smaller numbers are really better, the return on investment forecasting model is a slightly different animal. The return on investment is measured in percent, and it looks for the largest percentage of a return on an upfront investment. Here's how it is calculated. The project return of investment is the difference between the total expected benefits from the result or the service that a project is expected to produce, minus the total expected costs, that is the upfront investment into the project and all the people and the paychecks and the resources that make the project happen, divided by these total expected costs. So for example, if we are expecting the result or service of a project to make $115,000 over its lifetime that it is deployed, we have to subtract the initial investment into the making of this project outcome or result itself, which would be, in our example, $100,000. Then we divide that by this initial investment into the project life cycle of $100,000, and out comes 15%. And of course, the idea is that the project return on investment should be as large as possible. In other words, bigger here is better. The fourth forecasting method that we're discussing here is called net present value. Net present value is a little bit more complex because it looks at the value of the money that we can make from a project, service, or result in the future and compares it to the initial investment now. Net present value then has something to do with the letter R, and the letter R is what you're seeing in the equation here on the left side. The letter R is called the discount rate. The discount rate is a percentage that is set in an organization and that describes the gain or loss of value in the future. So the net present value, in short, really looks at the cash flow at the beginning of a project, which is the investment into the making or conducting of the project, and then adds to that the sum of the expected net cash flow that is being divided by 1 plus this discount rate, and is the 1 plus the discount rate is being taken to the power of the time period over which we are expecting a return on this project investment. That is the time period over which we expect the project to produce an increase in value to the organization. So at the bottom of the slide is our example. We're seeing that the project is being conducted in year 0 and is supposed to yield 4 years worth of results. The cash inflow in our year 0 is 0 because this is when we're developing the product or the service. The cash outflow is $200,000 because that is our investment into the running of the project. That's what we're going to pay for the project as a company. So the net cash flow here is minus $200,000, which in your equation above is the minus I0. And our discounted cash flow is the minus $200,000. In year 1, we are expecting $150,000 of cash inflow and $85,000 of cash outflow for, say, product maintenance, for example. And so our net cash flow is 150,000 minus 85,000, and that gives us a net cash flow of $65,000. Now we're going to apply the formula above, where we take the net cash flow and we divide it by 1 plus and then our R, which is 8%. And because we are in year 1, we take that to the first power, which gives us a discounted cash flow for year 1 of $60,185,000. In year 2, our cash inflow is expected to be $200,000. So we're making more and more as our project outcome matures. And in year 3, $250,000, in year 4, $300,000. But our maintenance cost also increases from $85,000 to $125,000, and then $150,000 and $200,000 in years 3 and 4. So our net cash flow, again for year 2, is $200,000 minus $125,000, that's $75,000. Our net cash flow for year 3 is $250,000 minus $150,000, that is $100,000. And the same in year 4, $300,000 minus $200,000 is $100,000. So we apply our formula again for net cash flow that we have calculated, 75,000 or 100,000, divided by 1 plus R. Our R is still 8%. And then to the power of the year in which we have generated the net cash flow. In year 2, that is to the power of 2. In year 3, that is to the power of 3. And in year 4, it is to the power of 4. So in year 2, we are generating $64,300 as discounted cash flow. In year 3, we are generating $79,383 as discounted cash flow. And in year 4, we are generating $73,503 as discounted cash flow. So now we are ready to calculate our net present value. Remember, our net present value is the investment, that is the negative number, then plus a sum of all the discounted cash flows for each year. So that's what you're seeing at the bottom of the slide, minus $200,000 plus the $60,185 from year 1, plus the $64,300 from year 2, plus the $79,383 from year 3, plus the $73,503 from year 4. That gives us a net present value of our $200,000 investment of $77,371. Of course, a net present value that is bigger will allow us a better valued project outcome. So now that we have done all our math, we can compare the outcomes of all our forecasting tools and assemble them with our other project selection criteria. We can weight them and then score them. Once we have determined which projects rank the highest on our execution list, we can start putting together the business case. Please stop the video at this point and read through the contents of a good business case template. Now that all business cases have been written, it is time to compare them with one another and make the final selection of projects for the initiation phase. When all business cases have been composed, the organizational decision makers, typically at the executive level, get to make their selection of projects that will be implemented in order to ideally support the organizational strategy and priorities. Very often, these decision makers look at the business cases through the eyes of what is called the balanced scorecard. The balanced scorecard contains 4 different perspectives. The first one is the financial perspective, followed by the customer perspective, then by the innovation and learning perspective that will help with organizational improvement, and then finally the internal processes perspective, so that the internal improvements in processes produce a more efficient and effective organization. When the business case scores favorably in all 4 sectors, then the project will most likely be selected for implementation. And now that at the executive level, a list of projects has been compiled, it is finally time to talk about project infrastructure, because the next step in our project lifecycle will be for the executive team to select a pool of project managers and to distribute the projects among them. In this module, we will go over the final deliberations before assigning and starting a project, such as the ideal structure of a project lifecycle, such as the selection criteria for a good project manager as well. Here you see only some of the questions that the executive team will be asking themselves once the business case has been approved. Most specifically, who will be the project manager, namely the person who the executive team trusts with the execution of the project? Who will be the project sponsor, that is, the person who has final financial responsibility for the project? Who will be on the project team? And what role will everybody play? Finally, what will be the specifics of the project in terms of schedule, in terms of scope, first of all, in terms of budget, in terms of approach and techniques, and all of these specifics. Most of these questions are being answered in the project integration knowledge area. In the initiating phase, the develop project charter process tries to nail down answers to these questions in the deliverable called the project charter. The project charter is the contract between the project manager, who is authorized through the project charter to conduct the project, and the organization, whose counterpart to the project manager is the project sponsor. Once the project manager has been authorized through the project charter to go ahead with executing the project manager then develops the project management plan, directs and manages the project work, and is off to the races with managing the project knowledge, monitoring and controlling the project work, that is, making sure that we're still on target, and performing integrated change control, that is, making sure that no changes happen without change control processes or project change requests, and closing the project or closing the project phase. And it doesn't matter whether that happens in a waterfall structure or, as we have discussed in the first module of this course, in an iterative fashion in which building, testing, and implementation in the SDLC happen a number of times over. So how is a project manager selected, and how is a project team selected, and how does an actual project get going? Before the project sponsor, ideally, sets out to write the project charter, a few questions need to be answered, namely, what is the work that needs to be done? Who will do the work? What resources are needed? And when will they do the work? How long will it take? How much will it cost? And will all the investment, in fact, support the project's measurable organizational value? So, in other words, the project sponsor ideally will put into relation the project's intended measurable organizational value with the project objectives, and then the project governance, that is the project leadership, and the resources that are needed in order to work on the project. The most important thing probably here is project governance, because project governance is really derived from organizational governance, meaning the people who are in charge of determining the direction something should go on the organizational level, and that is being taken down to the project level. And project governance typically is a shared responsibility between the project sponsor and maybe the PMO, if there is a PMO there as well, and that depends on the type of the organization within which the project manager works, whether it's a functional organization, a projectized organization, or any kind of the matrix organizations that we have become familiar with through the last module. So project governance typically defines the structure, the authorization, the oversight, and the accountability of all project leadership. That includes the project sponsor as mostly the financial leadership who approves everything, and the project manager who is the executive leadership of the project, but who still has to look to the project sponsor for all major decisions and approval of any financial changes or any changes to other project parameters. Here's another breakdown that puts into context project governance within the different kinds of organizational structures and the project teams themselves. Now, typically the project manager will have a managerial role or a leadership role that really transforms into a servant role, because the project manager makes sure that the team always has everything that they need in order to leverage their technical skills, in order to employ their organizational knowledge, and in order to improve their interpersonal skills, because the mission is to drive the project forward. This also means that the project manager's role really is in the service of the project's mission. And that means the project manager needs to understand when it is important to empower the team members and when to get out of the way. This is why it's important to understand how in an organization the lines of authority and responsibilities work, how the reporting relationships work within an organization, so that the project manager can leverage effective communication and can adjust decision-making mechanisms based on who needs to be involved in making these decisions. It is quite frequent in an IT organization that the required skill set in order to complete a project successfully is not present in-house. An organization there has the choice. Do we hire actual people on that have the skill set and we hire them on as firm employees? That is called full insourcing. Or do we hire either specific contractors or consultants who have a specific skill set for the duration of a specific project? That is called selective outsourcing. Or do we make a contract with a consulting company that will then send us, and own also, specific contractors that will complete a specific module on our project for the duration of the project? That is called full outsourcing. If this is done across country lines, very often this is also called offshoring. So full outsourcing often turns into offshoring. When outsourcing or offshoring has been decided upon, procurement deliberations take over. That includes how does the procurement process work? How can we make it work for the specific project? When should we start the process? How much external manpower or people power do we need? And where should that people power be located? So we're starting with a needs assessment, and that then transforms into, once we know what we need, a request for proposal that is being published. Once the answers from various vendors have been received based on a request for proposal, a request for bid goes out that then results into a number of bids on the project sponsors or even the project manager's desk. And that will lead to contract negotiations once the top 3 bidders have been selected. And finally, contract negotiations will end up in a contract with ideally 1 bidder or maybe a couple more. And here the contract form will be decided, the contract period and the price. Now we'll talk about contract negotiations more when we talk about project procurement, which in itself is a knowledge area. And then at the end of contract negotiations, the project manager will have an external team or a number of consultants available for the duration of the project, or for the duration for when they are needed. Once all the preparatory work has been done and the project manager has been decided upon, the project team members have been decided upon, and the outsourcing or offshoring model has been decided upon, everything can be formalized in a project charter. And this is where you, the project manager, come in, because the project charter is the expectation setting contract between the organization and you that specifies that under your leadership, the project is going to deliver the identified scope within the stated budget and within the stated schedule to create the measurable organization value that supports the organizational strategy and its stakeholders. Now, the PMBOK defines the project charter as a document that formally authorizes the existence of a project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. In other words, no project charter, no project. No project charter, no project manager. This is very important to know, because I have seen in many organizations a project manager leading a project without a project charter. This almost always leads to project failure. And here is why working without a project charter will lead to project failure. Because a project charter defines the project start and the project boundaries. It creates the formal record for the project, and it is a direct way for senior management to formally accept and to commit to the project. Now, if you think back to our first module in which we looked at all the reasons projects fail, one of the major reasons projects have failed in the past is because senior management has not shown an investment into the project. This can be remedied by the project charter being signed by the project sponsor, who typically is a member of senior management. Please pause the video at this point and review the parts of a good project charter that is shown at the bottom half of the slide. It seems that all the questions that we've seen in the bottom half of the previous slide could really be answered much better by the project manager, but who really owns the project charter? Who really owns the project charter is the project sponsor, because the project sponsor authorizes the project charter and thereby gives the authority to the project manager to spend the budget that has been allocated in the project charter and to complete the project within the specified time frame. And while the project manager may have done all the legwork for the project charter, including conversations, budget what ifs, schedule what ifs, that is different schedule scenarios, really the final approval and the responsibility for the project charter and for the project in itself stays with the project sponsor. Project charters come in all shapes and sizes. For larger projects, they tend to be bigger, almost small books. For smaller projects, they are shorter. In our course, we're going to work with a template that you're going to see in the next few slides. Here we're looking at the upper third of this template, and in the upper part, we're seeing the project governance information that starts with the project name, the SOW number, that's the statement of work number, the client name, the sponsor information, program manager, portfolio manager, project management team, and PMO support. This is very important because it lists all the entities and all the stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process about project funding, change requests, and other high-level administrative considerations. Below that governance information is probably the most important part of the project charter, namely the authorized by section. The authorized by section has to carry the project sponsor's signature. If this authorized by section does not carry the project sponsor's signature, guess what? You don't have a project and you are not a project manager. A project must have a charter in order to be a project, in order to be authorized by the project sponsor to spend the funding that is allocated to the project. Only an authorized project charter, that is a project charter that is authorized by the project sponsor, confirms the start of a project and the authorization to the project manager to begin work. Below the authorization line, including the signatures and the date, are the project description, that is a short description of what the project is going to do, and then right next to it, the business case, typically in 1 or 2 sentences, sometimes 3, in order to remind us why the project was selected in the first place and what the basic value proposition is of this project for the organization. The middle part of the project charter describes the project in more detail. Specifically, we're looking at the in-scope and out-of-scope section on the left side and the goals and objectives and target values section on the right side. Let's start with the left side. In order to ensure that we're building exactly the right thing, the in-scope section has to be filled out very comprehensively. This means we want to list everything in as much detail as it is known at this point that we are supposed to build and deliver. And that includes any services that we deliver, it includes any products that we deliver. We want to be as specific as we can so that someone cannot come later on and say, hey, you built the wrong thing. This also means that in order to be as specific as possible, we're including not just the in-scope part, but we're also talking about what is out of scope. Because as soon as we list items that are out of scope, that is expressly not included in our final project delivery, will we be able to fill any kinds of gaps that we may have left in the in-scope section. Being as precise as possible in these 2 sections will prevent something called scope creep later down the road in the project, where someone may come to you and say, you know, when you signed up for that piece of scope, you also signed up for XYZ, which in fact you didn't. If you mention XYZ in the out of scope section explicitly at the beginning of the project and the project charter, then that is a great communication vehicle to say, you know what, we decided that that would not be part of the project this time around. On the right side of our slide, we are seeing the goals and objectives section and the key success metrics. Remember that when the business case was established, the measurable organizational value proposition for this project was established as well. This means that the goals and objectives are derived expressly from this measurable organizational value proposition that we saw in the business case, which is also why the goals and objectives are directly beneath the business case in our project charter. The key success metrics then identify the exact targets that the project has to hit in order to be considered successful. The bottom third of our project charter consists of 4 important fields. Those are the assumptions and constraints, the risks, the budget, team, and preliminary schedule. The assumptions and constraints for a project are really a definition of the environment and the givens in the environment in which the project is being developed. Assumptions and constraints means these are the things that we can expect as project managers to be ready for us as we bring the team in and as we perform our work. Or constraints are the things that we can expect to be limiting us in the kind of work that we can do or in the ways that we can do our work. Risks, of course, are the things that could potentially go wrong in the project. And as we identify initially the risks at the outset of the project, we want to make sure to keep a good eye on these risks and constantly ask ourselves what else could potentially happen and perform what is called continuous risk identification throughout the project. Continuous risk identification occurs throughout the entire project cycle. It starts even before the project charter in the business case formation. And so the risks that you will be seeing in the project charter partially come from the business case even. Below the assumptions and constraints, you're seeing the allocated budget. This budget is in many cases a 50-50 budget, meaning that you have the option of with appropriate change requests go above and beyond that budget as the project progresses without any kind of penalty. And below the budget, you will see the intended team for the project. Now, this team may materialize. Typically, these people are already assigned to your team as the project manager when you receive this charter. Or this team may be still in formation, or this team may also slightly change. Then on the bottom right side of the screen, we have the preliminary schedule. The preliminary schedule typically outlines the major milestones in the project schedule. Here we're seeing, for example, charter approval. We're seeing a design completion. We're seeing implementation complete and approved. We're seeing gate reviews here, which is project phase end reviews and approvals by, you guessed it, the project sponsor. And then finally, project closure. So these dates also are, I don't want to say approximate. You should hit those dates, especially if they're at the end of a month, as you're seeing here for the preliminary schedule, January 31st, 2014. However, these can also be extended based on what happens during the project progress. But any information that you're seeing in this project charter, and that includes any scope information, any target information, any assumptions and constraints, risks, budget specifically, and schedule specifically, require really a change request. And this is the project change management knowledge area that we have discussed earlier. This brings us to the end of this week's module. Please make sure to be able to define and explain each of the words that you're seeing on the slide. And I can't wait to see you in our next module.